They trusted him with their bodies, their lives. He cut them open, stitched them closed, reassured them in a soft, confident voice that everything would be fine. But he wasn't a surgeon. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't even licensed to practice medicine. And by the time the truth came out 200 surgeries later, it was already too late. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe and stay with me until the end, because the twists in this story will leave you speechless. The story begins in a small clinic tucked away on the outskirts of a busy city. Let's call it Cedar Hills Medical Center. For many in the community, Cedar Hills was a beacon of hope. It catered to working-class families, immigrants, and those without the privilege of elite healthcare. Its slogan, "Compassionate Care for Everyone," was painted in big blue letters over the entrance, and in the center of it all stood a man named Dr. William Harris. Or at least that's what everyone thought. William was charismatic. In his early 40s, with neatly combed black hair streaked with gray, a calm baritone voice, and an easy smile that made people trust him instantly. He dressed the part: white coat, stethoscope, expensive watch glinting beneath the cuff. Patients described him as attentive, gentle, and miraculous. He took time with everyone. He listened. He reassured. For the single mother with gallbladder pain, he offered a low-cost surgery, promising she'd be home within days. For the young construction worker with a torn ligament, he spoke about cutting-edge techniques that would put him back on his feet. For the elderly man with stomach cancer, he promised compassion and a fighting chance. People believed in him, because why wouldn't they? Hospitals often feel cold, mechanical, but with Harris, the patients felt cared for, seen. But behind that carefully constructed facade was a secret darker than anyone imagined. Because Harris wasn't a doctor at all. If Harris wasn't a doctor, then who exactly was he, and how had he gotten away with it for so long? William Harris's real name was Michael Banning, and Michael had never attended medical school. His background was messy, a college dropout with a patchy employment record. He had once worked as a hospital janitor, then as a medical assistant, and later as a technician in a surgical ward. He had seen just enough to imitate the mannerisms of doctors, memorizing their vocabulary, watching how they wrote notes, even how they reassured frightened patients before wheeling them into operating rooms. But Michael was not licensed, not trained, not authorized. What he did have, however, was ambition and a dangerous ability to lie convincingly. When Cedar Hills Medical Center was struggling financially, Michael slipped in like a savior. He forged documents, faked medical diplomas, created a spotless resume complete with glowing recommendations from institutions that never existed. And when the hospital's desperate board reviewed his application, they saw exactly what they wanted to see: a skilled surgeon willing to work for half the salary others demanded. Within weeks, Dr. Harris was scrubbing in for surgeries. The first was a routine appendectomy. Then came gallbladders, hernias, knee repairs. Each success fed his confidence. Each grateful patient made him bolder. But what no one realized was this: his successes were built not on skill, but on sheer luck, and the patients who weren't so lucky often never spoke again. How many lives had already been ruined before someone finally started asking questions? First, no one questioned Harris. But medicine leaves little room for error, and Harris was making plenty. Nurses began whispering about his unusual surgical techniques. He skipped standard sterilization protocols. He ordered unusual dosages of anesthesia. Sometimes his stitches tore apart within days. Patients returned with infections, complications, and pain far worse than what they came in with. One nurse, Elena Ruiz, remembers a particularly haunting night. A young woman had been admitted for gallbladder surgery. Harris performed the operation himself. Hours later, the woman was pale, sweating, whispering that something wasn't right. Her blood pressure plummeted. Her abdomen swelled. Harris brushed it off as normal post-op discomfort. By morning, she was dead. Elena couldn't sleep that night. Something inside her told her the truth. This wasn't just a tragic complication. This was malpractice. But who would believe her? Harris was adored by patients and respected by administrators. To accuse him would mean risking her career. so she stayed quiet, and Harris kept cutting. But one tragic mistake, would finally rip open the illusion and expose Harris for what he really was. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Harris was scheduled to perform a simple orthopedic surgery on a teenage boy, just a ligament repair, the kind of operation real surgeons considered routine. But within minutes of making the first incision, Harris severed an artery. Blood gushed. The surgical team panicked. Nurses screamed for clamps, suction, anything to stop the bleeding. But Harris froze. The calm, confident mask shattered. He fumbled with tools, barked orders that made no sense, and finally stepped back, hands trembling. It was the anesthesiologist, a real doctor, who took control, ordering the team to call for backup. The boy survived, but barely. And afterward, the anesthesiologist reported Harris to the hospital board. First, the board resisted. Harris brought in patients, money, and reputation. He was one of their best. But when the anesthesiologist demanded to see Harris's credentials, demanded proof, everything started to unravel. And what they found next was far worse than anyone expected. The board requested Harris's medical license. He stalled, claimed his paperwork had been lost, that the licensing board was behind on renewals. But when investigators dug deeper, the truth emerged. No license, no degree, no record of him ever attending medical school. What they did find, however, were hundreds of forged documents, fake seals, invented professors, even fabricated letters of recommendation. It was a house of cards, and now it was crashing down. Police were called, patients were interviewed, and the horrifying tally began. Over 200 surgeries performed. Dozens of patients left with permanent damage. At least 7 deaths directly linked to his incompetence. The community was outraged. Families who had trusted him demanded answers. But Harris wasn't ready to face justice. Because before police could arrest him, Harris vanished. The morning of his arrest, Harris never showed up to the clinic. By the time police arrived at his apartment, it was empty. Clothes gone. Computer wiped. No sign of where he'd gone. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. For weeks, investigators chased leads. There were rumors he had fled to another state. Others claimed he was practicing again under a new name. One former patient swore she saw him in a grocery store in another town, smiling, wearing a baseball cap. The FBI got involved. Border alerts went out. His face appeared on wanted posters across the country. But still no Harris. Meanwhile, families were left with scars, physical and emotional. Lives permanently altered by a man who had played God with a scalpel. But when Harris was finally caught, it wasn't in the way anyone expected. Months later, Harris was discovered in a shocking place. Not in another state, not overseas, but in a different hospital, this time working as an assistant in another surgical ward under yet another fake name. He had slipped back into the system, undetected, preparing to climb the ladder once more. It was a janitor who recognized him from the news and tipped off police. When officers stormed the operating wing, Harris tried to run. But this time, there was no escape. He was handcuffed in front of staff and patients, the very world he had deceived collapsing around him. But the arrest was not the end. Because during the trial, secrets about Harris's past, and about the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked, would come spilling out. Secrets darker than anyone was prepared to hear. In the courtroom, Harris smirked as the charges were read. Fraud, manslaughter, practicing medicine without a license. But Harris's defense shocked everyone. He claimed that he was a victim of the system. He argued that hospitals were desperate, greedy, and willing to overlook red flags if it meant profit. He painted himself as a symptom, not the disease. And disturbingly, he wasn't entirely wrong. Investigations revealed that Cedar Hills had failed to properly verify his credentials. That administrators had ignored nurses' concerns because Harris was making them money. That oversight bodies had loopholes large enough for a fraud like him to slip through. Yes, Harris had lied. Yes, he had killed. But the system had enabled him. Families sat in the gallery, tears streaming down their faces, as lawyers debated not only Harris's guilt, but the guilt of an entire healthcare system built on trust, money, and fragile oversight. And then came the revelation no one saw coming. Something from Harris's past that threatened to turn the entire trial upside down. During the trial, prosecutors introduced new evidence. Harris, before Cedar Hills, had worked at 2 other clinics under different names. And in both places, patients had died under mysterious complications. But here's the chilling part. One of those clinics had quietly dismissed him after suspicions arose. Instead of reporting him, they simply let him go, washing their hands of the problem, allowing him to vanish and resurface elsewhere. This wasn't the first time Harris had played doctor. It was just the first time he'd been caught. The courtroom gasped. Families screamed. Reporters scribbled furiously. The picture was clear. Harris wasn't just a fraud. He was a predator, slipping through cracks left open by negligence, arrogance, and greed. And yet, Harris still had one final card to play. As the trial neared its conclusion, Harris leaned toward his attorney, whispering something that made the man pale. Then, with a smug grin, Harris demanded to take the stand. He didn't deny what he'd done. Instead, he boasted. He described surgeries in detail, mocking the doctors who had never noticed his incompetence. He laughed about forging diplomas. And then he dropped the bombshell. He wasn't done. He hinted that he had trained others. That somewhere, right now, there were students of his operating under fake names, copycats following in his footsteps. The courtroom fell silent. If he was lying, it was cruelty. If he was telling the truth, the nightmare wasn't over. The judge banged the gavel. The gallery erupted. Reporters raced to phones. And as Harris was dragged away in chains, one thought lingered in every mind. Was he bluffing? Or had the nightmare only just begun? This is where we'll pause our story. Because the truth about Harris or Michael Banning doesn't end in that courtroom. The deeper investigators dug, the more chilling secrets they found. Secrets about his childhood, his obsession with medicine, and the disturbing possibility that he wasn't the only one living this double life. You thought the nightmare ended when Michael Banning, alias Dr. William Harris, was dragged out of that courtroom in handcuffs. But what if I told you that was only the beginning? Because as investigators tore into his past, and as victims demanded justice, new questions emerged. Questions so disturbing, they made people wonder if Michael Banning was truly just one man, or part of something far more sinister. Stay with me until the end of this episode, because the revelations in part 2 will change the way you think about trust, medicine, and justice itself. In prison, Michael Banning became a legend. Other inmates whispered about him with a mix of awe and disgust. A man who had cut people open with no training. A man who had tricked entire hospitals. A man who looked ordinary but carried death in his hands. But where did this obsession come from? Investigators dug into his past, searching for answers. Born in a working-class neighborhood, Michael grew up with an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Poverty gnawed at his childhood. He was invisible, overlooked, ignored. But Michael found fascination in one place, the local hospital. As a boy, he spent hours loitering in the waiting room, watching the doctors sweep past in crisp white coats. To him, they looked like gods, respected, powerful, untouchable. Neighbors later recalled that even as a child, Michael would wrap towels around his neck like a stethoscope and play doctor in the alleyways. Except his games were never playful. He made kids lie down, cut open dolls, stitched them with shoelaces, and told anyone who'd listen, "One day, they'll listen to me." That hunger for recognition hardened into resentment. Michael wasn't smart enough or disciplined enough for medical school, but he was clever enough to fake it. Clever enough to step into the role he believed he was destined to play. But Michael's past wasn't just about obsession. There were darker secrets waiting to be uncovered, ones that suggested his fraud might have begun much earlier than anyone realized. Journalists uncovered chilling reports. Years before Cedar Hills, Michael had volunteered at a disaster relief camp overseas. He presented himself as a field medic, despite no training, and in that chaotic environment, where records were scarce and desperation was high, he experimented. He stitched wounds with unsterilized thread. He drained infections with kitchen knives. He even attempted amputations. Some victims survived. Others didn't. But because these were disaster zones, deaths were written off as inevitable. No one investigated. No one asked questions. It was his first taste of power, and it emboldened him to take the fraud further once he returned home. But when survivors from those camps recognized him years later in news reports, a horrifying new wave of allegations poured in. The courtroom in Part 1 had been filled with families from Cedar Hills. But now more voices began to rise. A mother from Haiti who said Michael operated on her child during a cholera outbreak. The boy died. A farmer from Honduras who claimed Michael removed a tumor, only for the wound to rot. A refugee from Syria who said Michael looked more nervous than the patients, shaking as he made incisions. One by one, these voices formed a chorus of pain. And suddenly, the picture of Michael Banning shifted. He wasn't just a local fraud who tricked one hospital. He was a predator without borders, exploiting chaos, poverty, and desperation wherever he went. But the most shocking revelation wasn't about what Michael had done. It was about who had helped him. As prosecutors combed through Michael's history, a disturbing pattern emerged. He hadn't acted alone. At Cedar Hills, administrators had ignored red flags. At earlier clinics, HR departments had overlooked glaring inconsistencies. And at the disaster relief camp, aid supervisors had accepted his claims without question because they were desperate for volunteers. In each case, someone had looked the other way. Someone had let him slip through. And why? Because he was useful. Because he made money. Because he solved staffing shortages. The system hadn't just failed, it had protected him. And when confronted, those institutions scrambled to cover their tracks. Hospitals quietly settled lawsuits. Administrators resigned quietly, slipping into new jobs without consequences. The victims, they were left behind, broken, scarred, forgotten. But not everyone forgot. One victim's family decided to fight back in a way that would shock the entire country. Meet Maria Lopez. Her father had died on Harris's table after what should have been a routine hernia surgery. But Maria wasn't willing to let her father become another statistic. She organized survivors and families into a coalition, the Cedar Hills Justice Group. They marched outside hospitals, held vigils for the dead, and demanded not only Harris's conviction but a reckoning for the entire healthcare system that enabled him. Michael Banning may have cut, Maria told reporters, but the system handed him the knife. The protests grew. Families from across the country joined. Media outlets picked it up. And soon, politicians were forced to weigh in. Lawsuits piled up, not just against Harris, but against the hospitals that hired him. And for the first time, the story wasn't just about a fraud. It was about accountability. But while the families fought for justice, inside prison walls, Michael was plotting something of his own. Inmates said Michael had a strange magnetism. Behind bars, he styled himself as a doctor again, offering medical advice to fellow prisoners. He told them which pills to trade, how to fake injuries, even how to suture wounds with smuggled thread. He was banned from the infirmary after trying to assist with a sick inmate. But here's the chilling part. Other prisoners began to worship him. Some called him document, others swore he had saved their lives. And slowly, rumors spread that Michael wasn't just manipulating his fellow inmates, but preparing a new generation of frauds. Was he bluffing, or had he actually begun teaching others how to replicate his crimes? Months after his conviction, police in another state arrested a man performing surgeries without a license. His forged documents looked eerily similar to Michael's. Then another case popped up, this time, a woman posing as a physician's assistant, with fake certifications matching Michael's old template. Investigators couldn't prove a direct link. But the question lingered. Had Michael truly trained others? Had his fraud become a blueprint for a new wave of imposters? Or was he simply inspiring desperate con artists who saw his story as proof of what was possible? Either way, the fear spread like wildfire. Patients asked, "Can we ever trust the system again?" But the darkest revelation was yet to come. Because buried deep in Michael's personal files was a secret even prosecutors hadn't been prepared for. When detectives cracked open Michael's encrypted laptop, they expected forged diplomas and fake IDs. What they found was worse. Michael had kept a diary, pages upon pages of detailed notes about every surgery, every mistake, every death. But he didn't write them like a man confessing. He wrote them like a scientist experimenting. Cold, detached, almost proud. One entry read, Patient 146, severe infection. Tried a different dosage this time. Failure. Lesson. Avoid repeat. Another, Patient 201, mid-40s male. Heart gave out. Interesting rhythm beforehand. Regret not monitoring closer. To Michael, his victims weren't people. They were test subjects. And that diary suggested one thing. He hadn't just been faking. He had been learning. But learning for what? That question haunted investigators. And it would lead to a final twist no one could have predicted. 2 years into his sentence, Michael requested a meeting with prosecutors. He had something to trade. He claimed he had information on a network of medical imposters operating across multiple states. Not just copycats, but people he had met, recruited, and guided over the years. If prosecutors reduced his sentence, he would give them names. The room went silent. If true, it meant Harris wasn't an isolated fraud. He was part of a web, one that could still be out there, operating, cutting, killing. If false, it was just another cruel bluff. Prosecutors didn't know what to believe. Families were terrified. The public demanded answers. And Michael? He just smiled, leaned back, and said one final sentence before the guards led him away. You've only seen the beginning, because now the question isn't just about Michael Banning. It's about us, our systems, our trust. Was Harris really part of a larger network? Are there others out there right now, slipping through the cracks, wearing white coats they never earned? And if so, how many more lives are at risk? You thought you knew the story of Michael Banning, the man who called himself Dr. William Harris, the fraud who performed over 200 surgeries without a license, the predator who left scars on bodies, families, and the healthcare system itself. But what if I told you his final revelation, that there was a network of imposter doctors, wasn't just a bluff? Part 3 takes us deeper than ever before, into courtrooms, prisons, and secret investigations that uncovered something bigger, stranger, and more terrifying than anyone expected. Stay to the end, because the final twist in this case will make you question everything about who you trust with your life. When Michael Banning offered prosecutors names of supposed imposters in exchange for a lighter sentence, most dismissed it as manipulation. But federal agents weren't willing to take the risk. Quietly, they launched a task force to test his claims. They called it Operation White Coat. Agents visited hospitals, clinics, and private practices across multiple states. They cross-checked credentials, verified licenses, and interviewed staff. What they discovered was chilling.
Michael Hadent-Lied.
At least 3 individuals, posing as surgeons, anesthesiologists, and even a psychiatrist, were exposed using the exact same forged techniques Michael had perfected. All of them had connections to Banning. Old co-workers, acquaintances from his days as a technician, even a man he'd met in prison before his first arrest. The network was real. But if Banning had trained others, how many more were still out there, operating in silence? Case 1. A man in Nevada posing as a psychiatrist. He counseled over 100 patients, prescribing dangerous mixes of medication. Several overdosed. Case 2. A woman in Texas who claimed to be a pediatric surgeon. She operated on infants. Some survived. Some didn't. Case 3. A nurse in Florida who faked her way into performing anesthesiology. Patients under her care never woke up. Each case sent shockwaves through the country. And with every revelation, reporters returned to the same chilling point. These people had been linked, directly or indirectly, to Michael Banning. He wasn't just a fraud. He was a teacher of frauds. But how had Banning learned to manipulate so perfectly? The answer lay in one final investigation into his own family. Investigators turned their attention to Michael's childhood. His father, long believed to be a factory worker, had a hidden past. He had once posed as a medic in Vietnam to escape dangerous deployments. Soldiers trusted him. He saved some. He lost others. But he came home with stories and a dangerous philosophy. Medicine isn't about degrees. It's about confidence. Michael grew up hearing those words. Neighbors recalled his father boasting, "Doctors are just men in costumes. Anyone can wear a costume." It was more than poverty that shaped Michael. It was indoctrination. His fraud wasn't just a crime. It was a twisted inheritance. But Michael didn't just inherit a philosophy. He inherited something else. Something physical that investigators would stumble upon in his family home. When agents searched the Banning family's old house, they found a dusty wooden trunk. Inside, forged military medical badges, the old surgical instruments, rusted with time, and dozens of notebooks, his father's. The notebooks described crude operations carried out in jungles and camps, amputations with saws, field stitches with barbed wire, experiments with medication. Michael hadn't just invented his fraud. He had studied it from childhood. He had been rehearsing for his role long before he ever set foot in a hospital. And when prosecutors confronted Michael with this evidence, he didn't deny it. He laughed, and then he said something that froze the room. "I didn't fail," Michael told investigators. "I succeeded." He claimed his surgeries were never about money or recognition. They were about proving his father right. Doctors, he insisted, were overrated. Degrees were meaningless. "I learned more with a stolen scalpel than most surgeons learn in 10 years. He bragged about teaching others, saying he was building a legacy, a movement of imposters who would expose medicine as nothing more than theater. "White coats," he sneered, "are costumes, and I gave others the courage to wear them." Prosecutors were horrified, but they also knew something else. They couldn't prove whether he was exaggerating or telling the truth. And then came the moment no one expected, when Michael's victims confronted him face to face. During a special hearing, survivors and family members were allowed to speak directly to Michael. Maria Lopez stood up first. She told him about her father, the man who trusted him, who died on his table. Her voice cracked with rage. "You stole more than his life," she said. "You stole our trust. You stole our peace." Other families followed. Stories of pain, infection, loss, children growing up without parents, parents burying children. Through it all, Michael sat stone-faced, until one young man approached. The boy Michael had nearly killed during the botched ligament repair, the mistake that had first exposed him. He walked with a limp now, his future in sports destroyed. "I live with your mistake every day," the boy said quietly. "And I hope you live with it too." For the first time, Michael's mask slipped. His eyes watered, just for a moment, but then he smiled and whispered, "I gave you a story worth telling." The courtroom erupted in fury. But the story wasn't over, because as Michael awaited sentencing, rumors began swirling inside the prison walls. Weeks before his final sentencing, whispers spread. Michael was planning something. Guards caught him sketching diagrams of hospital wings. They found scraps of paper with coded notes. One inmate swore Michael had bribed guards for supplies. Then, one night, the power flickered in the prison. By morning, Michael was gone. A nationwide manhunt erupted. Airports locked down. Highways were monitored. His face flashed across every news broadcast. And just when the world thought they had lost him forever, Michael resurfaced. Not in hiding, not in another state, but on a live video call, from an unknown location. And what he said on that call terrified the world. Michael's face appeared grainy on screens across the nation. "I told you," he said calmly. "You've only seen the beginning." He claimed he was free. He claimed he had allies. He claimed his students were already inside hospitals, clinics, and relief camps across the world. "You can't stop us," he said, "because you don't know who we are. And you never will." Then the feed cut out. Panic spread. Were his words the ramblings of a fugitive, or the truth? The FBI traced the call to a server overseas. But Michael himself was never found. To this day, his fate remains a mystery. And so we are left with the chilling question: did Michael Banning die a fugitive? His threats nothing more than delusions of grandeur? Or is he still out there, watching, planning, and guiding others to put on the white coat and pick up the scalpel? Because if his final words were true, then somewhere right now, someone who isn't a doctor may be holding a life in their hands. And you'd never know until it was too late.